Chuck Cecil, senior defensive assistant for the Arizona Wildcats, was a man who lived for football. His life had been defined by the sport, shaped by the highs and lows that only a coach could understand. It was the sound of helmets crashing, the smell of freshly cut grass, and the sight of players grinding through pain that fueled him. Today, though, the feeling was different. The Wildcats weren't just playing for pride, they were playing to hold on to the last shred of respect they had left. The season had been a disaster for Arizona. They had started with high hopes, but injuries, missed opportunities, and inconsistent play had marred their efforts. A 4-7 record heading into the game against their bitter rivals Arizona State meant they wouldn't be going to a bowl game. The Wildcats were fighting not for a championship, not for glory, but for survival. For the right to say, "We fought till the end." Chuck had always prided himself on his ability to inspire. He had been coaching for years, seen it all, been through the ringer of wins and losses. But there was something about this season that weighed heavier on his shoulders. The responsibility felt even more intense today. The Wildcats were on their home turf, but the stadium felt more like a battlefield than a place for celebration. Fans filled the stands, but there was an air of uncertainty. Everyone knew that this game, despite its significance, would not lead to a happily ever after. It would just be one more chapter in a season filled with disappointment. Chuck knew he had to do something. His usual pre-game speeches, full of fiery passion and bold proclamations, didn't seem to cut it anymore. His players were tired, defeated by the season, their spirits battered from every loss they had suffered. No, Chuck needed to give them something different. Something they hadn't seen yet. A spark, something to light a fire under them before they took the field. He paced the locker room, moving between players, shouting words of encouragement, clapping them on the back, trying to get them to snap out of their funk. His voice boomed off the walls, but the energy in the room was flat. No one was responding to him the way he needed. This wasn't just a game, this was the end of a season they needed to fight for. But how could he make them see that? How could he convince them that it wasn't over yet? Then his eyes landed on Owen Goss. The young cornerback was standing by his locker, adjusting his helmet with the same tired look as the rest of them. Goss was talented, there was no doubt about that. But he had been inconsistent, and Chuck knew that he had more to give than he was showing. Owen's fire was buried under layers of doubt, and Chuck wasn't about to let that slide. Chuck marched over to Owen, clapped him on the back, and said with a fierce grin, "Goss, today's the day you make your mark. You've got it in you, I know you do. Now let's show these guys who we are." Owen looked up, surprised by the intensity in Chuck's voice. Chuck could see the skepticism in his eyes. It was the same look that many of the players wore, as though they had given up on themselves long before the game had even started. Without hesitation, Chuck grabbed Owen's helmet. He yanked it toward him, his hand gripping it tightly as he pulled the young man toward him. The room seemed to fall silent as the players watched, their heads turning to witness what was about to unfold. "You're going to lead this defense today," Chuck said, his voice raw with emotion. "You're going to show them what it means to fight for this team. You hear me?" Owen nodded hesitantly, still unsure of what Chuck was about to do. But before Owen could react, Chuck did something that none of them expected. With a sudden burst of energy, Chuck slammed his own head into Owen's helmet. The metal collided with a loud clang, and Chuck's vision briefly blurred from the impact. The room went silent. Players stared, unsure of whether to laugh, cheer, or call for a timeout. Chuck, however, didn't wait for their reactions. He slammed his head into Owen's helmet again. The force was stronger this time, and Chuck could feel the pressure in his skull, but he was determined. He had to make an impact. He had to make them understand what was at stake. One more time, Chuck drove his forehead into Owen's helmet, the sound of metal colliding again. But as soon as he pulled back, a sharp pain shot through his head. His vision darkened for a split second, but he shook it off. It didn't matter. Players were already fired up. They were already ready to run through a wall. Chuck felt the blood start to trickle down his face, but he didn't have time to stop. The adrenaline coursed through him, and he was already thinking about the game ahead. He needed to be on the sideline, guiding his defense, keeping them focused, keeping them fired up. Pain in his forehead was nothing compared to the fight they were about to face on the field. He could feel the blood seeping under the brim of his cap, but he ignored it. He couldn't afford to be weak, not in front of these players, not in front of the enemy. The Sun Devils were coming, and they weren't going to be merciful. Chuck had seen them dominate in previous seasons, and today they looked just as dangerous. The game began, and Chuck's worst fears were realized almost immediately. Arizona State came out with their usual intensity. Their offense was explosive, and Arizona's defense couldn't keep up. Chuck's shouts from the sideline grew louder, but it didn't seem to matter. Arizona State was everywhere, moving the ball down the field with precision, easily picking apart the Wildcats' defense. First touchdown came fast, too fast. The Sun Devils had set the tone early, and Arizona, despite Chuck's relentless coaching, was already on the ropes. But Chuck didn't stop. He continued to bark instructions, his voice hoarse from the shouting. His players, however, were starting to fade. Their movements were sluggish, their energy drained by the relentless pace of Arizona State's offense. Chuck could see it, he could feel it in the air. The game was slipping away from them. It wasn't just the scoreboard that was a problem. It was the look in his players' eyes. They weren't just losing, they were losing hope. Chuck tried to keep them focused. Every time the defense faltered, he shouted louder, trying to reignite their passion. But the game was moving too fast, and Arizona State was too good. By the second quarter, the score was already 21-0. Arizona's defense was gasping for air, and Chuck was beginning to realize that no amount of motivation could change the outcome. Players were beaten. Arizona State's offense seemed unstoppable. And Chuck's head, the one that had been slamming into Owen's helmet, was still throbbing. He could feel the blood dripping down his face, but he refused to acknowledge it. The game wasn't over yet. There was still time to make a difference, or so he thought. But as the game continued, the gap widened. Arizona State's dominance was undeniable. The Wildcats couldn't keep up. Every touchdown felt like another blow, another step toward the inevitable end. By the third quarter, the game was all but decided. The Sun Devils were up 42-7, and Arizona had no answers. Chuck stood on the sideline, his face streaked with blood, his body exhausted, and his spirit faltering. His attempt to fire up his players had failed. The intensity he had hoped to instill in them had not translated onto the field. As the final whistle blew, signaling the end of the game, Chuck stood motionless on the sideline, watching Arizona State celebrate their victory. His heart was heavy with disappointment. Arizona had been beaten. They had been broken not just by Arizona State but by themselves. And Chuck, despite all his passion, all his effort, hadn't been able to turn the tide. In the locker room, the mood was somber. Players shuffled in, their heads low, their bodies spent. Chuck walked into the locker room last, his eyes scanning the defeated faces of his team. He was covered in blood, still wearing his cap, still pretending that everything was fine. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. He had given it his all. He had tried to inspire them. But football was a game of results, not intentions. And in that moment, Chuck realized that, despite everything he had done, it wasn't